Welcome to the next part of part 2 of Reedsport Legal. Hang in there. You made it through the tough stuff. Now let's hear some good stuff. Some of the things that are going on behind the scenes. And I'd ask anybody, check out this whole deal. It's called Changes on the Horizon, Dawn of the Golden Age. It's on the NESARA, the National Economic and Securities Reformation Act. So anyhow, here's some good news.
Located within the 677 acres of the city, found within the heart of Greater London, this tiny strip of land contains the world's most powerful banking houses, such as the Bank of England and Lloyd's of London, owned by the House of Rothschild. It is these bankers and their counterpart, the Temple Bar attorneys, that constitute the power base known simply as the Crown. Even though the Queen of England is a member of this club, she is not its corporate head. That job was given to the Pontiff of Rome. The Pope was given control over the monarchy with the signing of the Treaty of 1213 between King John and Pope Innocent III, which forever pledged England as a vassal state of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1297, that treaty was used as a precedent to incorporate the city as an independent city-state controlled by the Vatican, which would govern England without directly relying on the monarchy. Just like how the corporation of the United States was subject to the Crown of England, so too were the subjects of the British Empire, enslaved with debt by the financial division of the Vatican, headquartered within the City of London. Today, this small clique of bankers have full authority over the affairs of Parliament, and this has been the case since 1694, when Pope Innocent XI hired William of Orange to depose the Stuart kings and charter the Bank of England. Located within the Crown of England is the original Federal Reserve Charter, which according to the Farmer Claims legal team, allocates that 67% of the income tax collected by the IRS was be divided to the Crown of England. Another 23% was be paid as a dividend to the 300 shareholders of the Federal Reserve Bank, and the last 10% was be paid to the employees of the IRS to keep them quiet about this sweet deal. Since 1913, none of the income tax collected by the IRS has gone to the federal government. The federal government is funded totally through black budget sources such as drug trafficking and off-budget accounting on the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. The Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, also known as the CAFR, was based on techniques first used by the Mafia to hide their assets. In 1946, the government adopted the same methods when a private organization known as the Government Finance Officers Association created a policy which changed the government from a pay-as-you-go structure into a for-profit structure used by corporate America. Soon after, governments began using a financial statement which allowed them to create multiple profit centers and investment accounts, and to do it in such a way that the public would never figure out. Over time, the government began to make so much money that they overtook the Mafia as the biggest game in town. In 1977, GOFA spun off another private organization known as the Government Accounting Standards Board, which promoted the lucrative benefits of a standardized financial statement. Soon all local, county, and state governments jumped on board and began producing their own version of either a comprehensive annual financial report or an annual financial report, or on the federal level, a consolidated financial statement. As of 2005, there are over 148,000 individual government financial statements in the United States, with a combined local, state, and federal level investment of at least $110 trillion. With so much money, one must ask why the government has any debt at all. To answer this is complex, because the government's debts are financed indirectly through their own investment funds. This was done to subject the people to the repayment of the debt, while at the same time the government could steal all the wealth of the people. The CAFR allows the government to hide their assets through the use of two sets of accounting books. One is the budget report, which is presented to the public as the actual budget. The only income that must be reported in government budget reports are taxes, fines, and fees. But this is only a small image within the entire financial picture. The other set of accounting books are known as the financial statements of the CAFR, the AFR, and on a federal level, the CFS. These show a more complete financial condition of the government, which includes all the income generated from government liquid investment funds, bond financing accounts, and corporate stock portfolios. Some examples of these investment centers include self-insurance, enterprise operations, self-debt funding accounts, hundreds, if not thousands, of specialty funding accounts, creatively enacted advanced forward liability accounts, federally funded program accounts, pensions, real estate venture projects, and property seized by the state.
Okay, blah, blah, blah. I want you guys to hear the good stuff. So you can watch the full version. It's in the playlist. You guys, there's a ton of playlists. There's something in there for everybody. But anyhow, let's try and skip forward here and try and get to some of the better stuff.
Printing, loaning, or withdrawing money, they were able to profit from the artificially created boom and bust cycles caused by the Fed's manipulation of the interest rates, which resulted in either inflation or deflation of the money supply. This is why the stock market crashed in 1929. In the roaring 1920s, the Fed loaned easy money to the public, creating a boom period. But in 1929, these loans were called in, artificially reducing the money supply and forcing people into bankruptcy. However, members of the elite were able to get out of the stock market before the crash thanks to an insider tip from Paul Warburg, who served as both chairman of the CFR and advisor to the Federal Reserve. By 1930, the fallout of the Great Depression, the government thinks you will make over your lifetime. But there was one small snag in all this. In order for the government to write checks from a prepaid account, they have to receive permission from you. This occurs when you voluntarily sign a Social Security SS5 form.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
To persuade people to sign this form, the government will dangle insurance and retirement benefits in your face, but fail to inform you of what you are giving up, or rather, what you will become. By receiving Social Security retirement benefits, you are now considered a federal personnel of the government of the United States, which makes you ineligible to challenge the bankruptcy of the United States. And you are no longer considered a state citizen, but a 14th Amendment citizen, subjecting you to the repayment of the national debt. Accessing and using these funds is beyond the scope of this documentary. However, if you'd like to locate your prepaid account number, then look for them on either your birth certificate or within your IRS individual master file, or the red-colored QSIP serial number located on the backside of all recently issued Social Security cards. This will look different than your Social Security number, as it contains one letter and 8 numbers. The first letter designates which one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks that is recording your bond within its commercial book entry system, and the 8-digit number is your account number, which is traded as a stock certificate in either Switzerland or Puerto Rico. After the bankruptcy of the Corporation of the United States in 1933, its assets were placed under the control of the Secretary of Treasury as its appointed receiver. And then in 1944, the corporation's assets were quitclaimed under the control of the newly created International Monetary Fund. The IMF, along with the World Bank and GATT, were all created in 1944 during the Bretton Woods Agreement. Their policies have allowed the bankers to capture within the United States all its gold, national parks, nonprofit corporations, all property of 14th Amendment citizens, and even the birth certificate bonds. These assets are now managed by the governor of the IMF, who just so happens to be the Secretary of Treasury and a paid employee of the IMF. Today, the IMF holds a 51% ownership over the corporate government, Interpol, and even the Office of Personnel Management, which is responsible for sending paychecks to all federal employees. Not only has the IMF gained control over the land and the people of the United States, they managed to steal all its monetary gold under a system of institutionalized inflation created by the Bretton Woods Agreement, which dictated that U.S. tax dollars would finance the construction of factories in foreign lands to compete with American jobs. When this money was being sent overseas, the United States gold reserve shrank from 80% of the world's gold in 1946 to 22% by 1971. This gold ultimately made its way into the bankers' personal coffers in mainland Europe. By the 1960s, state governors were becoming concerned of the IMF takeover of the American economy and with the legality of privately issued Federal Reserve notes, which had been declared as unlawful money within their own national and state constitutions. So in 1962, at the National Governors Conference in Lexington, Kentucky, state governors met with IMF leaders to discuss solutions to help mitigate the constitutional crisis at hand. They agreed the best approach was to reincorporate all states under the same jurisdiction of the IMF and to do away with constitutional law and replace it with the tenets of the Uniform Commercial Code and the Code of Federal Regulations, which can only be enforced at administrative tribunals and admiralty law courts. This gave them even more control over the people, because instead of the masses governing themselves within the limits of the law like the Constitution dictates, they would now govern the people under a strict set of codes which can be used for corruption. By 1972, all the states had incorporated these guidelines, and ever since, the people lost all constitutional protections. With the help of the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, and the World Bank, the international bankers had exported the American slave grid to the entire world. In 1945, the United Nations Organization was established in the heart of the British colony's financial district of New York City. Not only had the Crown of England recaptured her colony, she now had full control over the world's financial system. The corruption of the banks and the federal government had become so pervasive, they truly believed themselves to be above the law. In 1963, the CIA murdered John F. Kennedy for attempting to print gold and silver-backed certificates and for setting up a gold-backed international reserve currency.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
President Reagan was well aware of what was going on when he was quoted as saying in a 1982 Grace Commission report, "None of the federal income tax paid by the American people is ever deposited into the United States Treasury, but instead is deposited into the Federal Reserve Bank for its use and benefit."
When President Reagan was elected, one of the first things that he did was appoint a blue ribbon panel of business people headed by Peter Grace, and is commonly referred to as the Grace Commission. And their job was to research all the various areas of the federal government and make a report. One of the quotes from the Grace Commission is, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt. All individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services taxpayers expect from government.
I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American. Death and taxes may be inevitable, but unjust taxes are not.
In 1981, Reagan attempted to place the United States on a gold banking system, but before he could, he was assassinated by John Hinckley, whose family incidentally worked closely together in the oil business with George Bush Sr. After his death, Reagan was replaced with a clone, which continued to serve out the presidency without the public's knowledge. Over the passing years, the Federal Reserve System continued to bury the people with debt. The United States was transformed from a constitutional republic to a debtor's nation, and then to its current form of a legislative democracy controlled by a fascist government. And they did so by transferring all the assets and future assets of the people into the hands of the international bankers. Since the fall of Atlantis, Satan and his minions have been working tirelessly to end all goodness on this planet. But God and the Brotherhood of Light have put together their own plan to defeat the dark side. Throughout history, many prophets have come forth to speak of the coming golden age of humanity. This truth was made known only to fall silent on the deaf ears of the ignorant masses. But change is on the horizon. The power grab of the elite is coming to an end. all their power and money, the bankers thought themselves to be above the law, but cracks were now appearing in their foundations. Angry Americans were beginning to fight back. A class action lawsuit was brewing, which would threaten to change the balance of power. This change began in the mid-1970s, when the Federal Land Bank illegally foreclosed on farmers' mortgages all throughout the Midwest. In each of these cases, the farmers were defrauded by the banks with the approval of the Federal Reserve System. These court cases would eventually become known as the Farmers' Claims Program. In 1978, an elderly ranch farmer in Colorado purchased a farm with a loan from the Federal Land Bank. After he died, the property was passed on to his son, Roy Swassenger Jr., who was a retired military general. Soon after, a Federal Land Bank officer and federal marshal appeared on his property and informed him the bank was foreclosing on his farm and to vacate within 30 days. Without his knowledge, his deceased father signed a stipulation which reverted the property back to the Federal Land Bank in the event of the borrower's death. Outraged, Roy Swassenger filed a class action lawsuit in the Denver federal court system, but the case didn't go very far and the suit was dismissed from filing incorrectly. This began Roy Swassenger's investigation into the inner workings of the banking system. In 1982, he was given a contract by the U.S. Senate and later the Supreme Court to investigate banking fraud, but because he was under a strict non-disclosure order, he was not allowed to tell the media what he discovered. In the late 80s, he began sharing his knowledge with others, including high-ranking military personnel, who helped bring about a class action lawsuit against the federal government. The first series of these lawsuits began in the mid-1980s, when William and Shirley Baskerville of Fort Collins, Colorado, were involved in a bankruptcy case with First Interstate Bank of Fort Collins, who was trying to foreclose on their farm. At a restaurant, their lawyer informed them that he would no longer be able to help them and walked off. Overhearing the conversation, Roy Swassenger offered his advice on how to appeal the case in bankruptcy court. So in 1987, they filed an appeal with the United States District Court in Colorado. On November 3, 1988, the Denver federal court system ruled that indeed the banks had defrauded the Baskervilles and proceeded to reverse its bankruptcy decision. But when the foreclosed property was not returned, they filed a new lawsuit. Eventually, 23 other farmers, ranchers, and Indians swindled by the banks in the same manner would join in the case. In these cases, the banks were foreclosing on the properties using fraudulent methods such as charging exorbitant interest, illegal foreclosure, or by not crediting mortgage payments to their account as they should have, but instead would steal the mortgage payments for themselves, triggering foreclosure on the property. After running out of money, they continued their fight without the help of lawyers. With some assistance by the Farmers Union, a new lawsuit was filed against the Federal Land Bank and the Farmers Credit System. The district court ruled in their favor and ordered the banks to return the stolen properties with help from either federal marshals or the National Guard. But when no payments were made, the farmers declared involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy against the Federal Land Bank and the Farmers Credit System. The banks appealed their case, insisting they were not a business, but a federal agency. Therefore, they were not liable to pay the damages. So the farmers' legal team adopted a new strategy. According to the Federal Land Bank's 1933 charter, they are not allowed to make loans directly to applicants, but instead could only back loans as a guarantor in case of default. Because the Federal Land Bank had violated this rule, the farmers' legal team was able to successfully sue the bank for damages. Word of the lawsuit began to spread. The legal team would teach others how to fight foreclosure and to help them file lawsuits as well. Celebrities, such as Willie Nelson, joined in the case and helped raise money during his Farm Aid concerts. Here's a short clip of Willie Nelson describing in his own words the series of events leading up to the Farmers' Claims legal case.
This whole thing started when agriculture collapsed.
He was saying that
The housing thing came second.
Tell us about it.
Well, I've been in Farm Aid a long time, and I've been seeing 8 million family farmers leave the farm. And there was 8 million, and now there's less than 2 million, losing 300 to 500 a week. The reason they're going is because they're going out and taking the land back, and now they're taking the houses back that they sold. I mean, they told the farmer to plant, fence post to fence post. We'll take care of you, buddy. Loaned him more money than he can pay back. And then he wound up losing his farm.
Yeah.
Same thing happened to the house owner. Loaned him more money than he can pay back. Now, the next thing you know, the government's got all the land, all the money, and we just give the asshole $600-700 billion more dollars.
The Baskerville case had now become the Farmer Claims class action lawsuit. Worried about the legal ramifications, the government retaliated against the farmers by hitting them with either outrageous IRS fees or by imprisoning the legal team under frivolous, non-related charges. When the farmers realized they were being unfairly targeted, they had military generals, such as General Roy Swassenger, sit in the courtroom to make sure the bribed judges would vote according to constitutional law. The farmers, now with a large team of knowledgeable people with the law behind them, filed a new case to claim additional damages from the fraudulent loaning activities of the Farmers Credit System. The government tried to settle, but they had already lost many cases and were now losing the appeal.
I'm going to interject there. Anybody out there that watches these videos, I've got a huge playlist on everything from foreclosures to child support, no-fault divorces. That's why I put this channel together. But let me tell you something real quick like here about foreclosures. Please contact us here at Reedsport Legal. I've defended successfully 12 foreclosures. I wish I had more time to teach people, but just like they're talking about here, it all got hush-hushed, and every foreclosure is fraudulent. Virtually 100% of them, they're robo-signed. Think about it. When you went to the bank, when I bought my house, a drug house in Reedsport, because Reedsport, they seem to be protecting a certain drug dealer, so I decided I'd buy the house out from underneath them and kick the guy out. And we did, and blah, blah, blah. The point being is, when you go to the bank, it's a one-party contract. You're the only people signed, and you or your wife, and the bank doesn't sign. You can't have a one-party contract. There's the first thing right off the bat. Every foreclosure document is fraudulent. There's no blue ink. They're all robo-signed. Nobody ever had the real deed. Nobody can produce the real deed. Just like a title to the car, they can't produce the real original title to your house. So please, don't anybody lose a house out there. We do pro bono work here at Reedsport Legal. And I'll tell you what, you guys think I don't know what I'm talking about. I dare any of you to come on and do an interview. I don't care whether you're a lawyer. I don't care whether you're a cop. I don't care who you are. I can defend all my legal positions. So point is don't lose a foreclosure, all right? Contact Reedsport Legal. Sorry to interrupt, guys. Love ya.
Appeals as well. More and more evidence was collected. According to the National Banking Act, all banks are required to register their charters with the Federal and State Bureau records, but none of the banks complied, allowing the legal team to sue the Farmers Credit System. Not only was the Farmers Credit System not chartered to do business with the American Banking Association, but so were other quasi-government organizations, such as the Federal Housing Administration, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and even the Federal Reserve Bank. The farmers' claim lawsuit was thrown out of court at each level, with the records purposely destroyed. So in the early 1990s, Roy Swassenger brought the case before the United States Supreme Court. Some of the content of this case is sealed from public eyes, but most of it can be viewed today. Almost unanimously, the U.S. Supreme Court justices ruled that the farmers' union claims were indeed valid. Therefore, all property foreclosed by the Farmers Credit System was illegal, and those who were foreclosed on would have to receive damages. In addition, they ruled that the U.S. federal government and banks had defrauded the farmers and all U.S. citizens out of vast sums of money and property. And furthermore, the court ruled the shocking truth that the IRS was a Puerto Rican trust, that the Federal Reserve was unlawful, that the Income Tax Amendment was only ratified by 4 states, and therefore was not a legal amendment, that the IRS code was not enacted into positive law within the Code of Federal Regulations, and how the U.S. government illegally foreclosed on farmers' homes with help from federal agencies. Irrefutable proof was presented by a retired CIA agent. He provided testimony and records of the bank's illegal activities to lead further evidence that the farmer union claims were indeed legitimate. The implications of such a decision were profound. All gold, silver, and property titles taken by the Federal Reserve and IRS must be returned to the people. The legal team sought assistance from a small group of benevolent visionaries consisting of politicians, military generals, and business people who have been secretly working to restore the Constitution since the mid-1950s. Somehow, within their ranks, a 4-star U.S. Army general received title and receiver of the original 1933 United States bankruptcy. When the case was brought before the United States Supreme Court, they ruled in his favor, giving the Army General title over the United States Incorporated. Legal action was then passed on to the Senate Finance Committee and Senator Sam Nunn, who was working with Roy Schlesinger.
I will tell you the price of buying back the United States government. It's $500 million a year. In the early 90s, Newt Gingrich and the Republicans got together. Their plan is now on the street. It's been exposed by a Columbia professor. They concluded that they could buy the United States government from school board to state house to White House for $300 million a year, and by golly, they did.
With help from covert congressional and political pressure, President George H.W. Bush issued an executive order on October 23, 1991, which provided a provision allowing anyone who has a claim against the federal government to receive a payment as long as it's within the rules of the original format of the case. According to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, all present and succeeding debts against the U.S. Treasury must be assumed by the Federal Reserve. Thus, the farmers' legal team was able to use that executive order to not only force the Federal Reserve to pay out damages in a gold-backed currency, but allow them to receive legal ownership over the bankruptcy of the United States Incorporated. To collect damages, the farmers' legal team used an obscure attachment to the 14th Amendment, which most people are not aware of. After the Civil War, the government allowed citizens to claim a payment on anyone who suffered damages as a result of the federal government failing to protect its citizens from harm or damages by a foreign government. President Grant had this attachment sealed from public eyes, but somehow someone on the farmers' legal team got a hold of it. If you listen to that carefully, it specifies damages by a foreign government. That foreign government is the corporate federal government, which has been masquerading to the public as a constitutional government. Remember, this goes back to the Organic Act of 1871 and the Trading with the Enemies Act of 1933, which defined all citizens as enemy combatants under the federal system known as the United States. The justices and farmers' legal team recognized how evil and corrupt our federal government had become, and to counteract this, they added some provisions in the settlement to bring the government back under control. First, they would have to be paid using a lawful currency backed by gold and silver as the Constitution dictates. This would eliminate inflation and gyrating economic cycles created by the Federal Reserve System. Second, they would be required to go back to common law instead of admiralty law under the gold fringe flags. Under common law, if there is no damage done or harm done, then there is no violation of the law. This would eliminate millions of laws which are used to control the masses and protect corrupt politicians. Lastly, the IRS would have to be dismantled and replaced with a national sales tax. This is the basis of the NESARA law. When the legal team finally settled on a figure, each individual would receive an average of $20 million payout per claim, multiplied by a total of 336,000 claims that are filed against the U.S. federal government. The total payout will come out to a staggering $6.6 trillion. The U.S. Supreme Court placed a gag order on the case, struck all information from the Federal Registry, and placed all records in the Supreme Court files. Up to that point, Senator Sam Nunn had kept the Baskerville case records within his office. A settlement was agreed to out of court, and the decision was sealed by Janet Reno. Because the case was sealed, claimants are not allowed to share court documents to media outlets without violating the settlement, but they can still tell others about the lawsuit. This is probably why you have
Speaking of which, and interrupting again, we saw that picture there of the Supreme Court justices. Here's an Easter egg for you guys. Look up what they did to Justice Scalia. There ought to be a lesson here, boy. If you're a president or somebody political, you don't go hunting in Texas. Texas has a bizarre law called the He Needed Killing Law. But anyhow, if you do a little bit of research there, you'll find that it's clearly proven scientifically now that Scalia was poisoned with foxglove. You know them little purple flowers we see growing, they hang down, look like bells? Yeah, check that out. Google that sometime. Yeah, we kill Supreme Court judges, JFK. One thing we're known for is we can kill anybody, anytime, anywhere, for any dang reason.
I haven't heard about this. In 1991, General Lloyd Schlesinger went before a Senate committee to present evidence of the bank's and government's criminal activity. He informed them how the corporation of the United States was tied to the establishment of a new world order, which would bring about a fascist one-world government ruled by the international bankers. So in 1992, a task force was put together consisting of over 300 retired and 35 active U.S. military officers who strongly supported constitutional law. This task force was responsible for investigating government officials, congressional officers, judges, and the Federal Reserve. They uncovered the common practice of bribery and extortion committed by both senators and judges.
And every single member of Congress is impeachable for having abdicated their Article I responsibilities under the Constitution and serving as foot soldiers for the president and his mendacious vice president.
The criminal activity was so rampant that only 2 out of 535 members of Congress were deemed honest. But more importantly, they carried out the first ever audit of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was used to giving out orders to politicians and had no intentions of being audited. However, after they were informed their offices would be raided under military gunpoint if necessary, they complied with the investigation. After reviewing their files, the military officers found $800 trillion sitting in accounts which should have been applied to the national debt. And contrary to federal government propaganda, they also discovered that most nations had in fact owed money to the United States instead of the other way around. These hidden trillions were then confiscated and placed into European bank accounts in order to generate the enormous funds needed to pay the Farmer Claims class action lawsuit. Later, this money would become the basis of the prosperity programs. Despite these death blows, President George H.W. Bush and the Illuminati continued on with their plans of global enslavement.
When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role